that, I will hand it over to Michael Trice to begin our event. Reverend Dr. Michael Trice, Michael Reid Trice, right, is our moderator. And he is Spihar Halligan Professor and founding director of the Center for Ecumenical and Interreligious Engagement at Seattle University. He is the founder of Religica, a popular virtual and multimedia platform. Trice served as the Executive Associate for Ecumenical and Interreligious Relations for the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, on the Board of Directors for Church World Service, as liaison to the White House Office of Faith-Based and Neighborhood Partnerships during the Obama administration, on the Board of the Parliament of the World's Religions, and served on the legal team of Judge Robinson O. Everett, which successfully argued at the U.S. Supreme Court against racial gerrymandering in North Carolina voting districts. He presents and writes widely in his field.
Thank you, Emma, and thank you all for attending today's webinar dedicated to religion and civic spaces, navigating challenges and fostering unity. And thank you also to our panelists today. You know, religious communities and interfaith councils play positive roles in civic life that assist us in addressing major societal challenges. And today, you know, we live in a national context in which we experience political fragmentation and a rise in illiberal elements that also use religion as a means of justifying their cause. As we approach the upcoming presidential election in the United States, we asked 5 trusted leaders to join us and to give us their view of a challenge they had to choose that we face. And then they had to respond to the challenge and suggest how they would ask us to consider our own responses to that challenge. So let's get to it. This webinar is part of a larger collaborative effort with the Parliament of the World's Religions and our commitment to FOCUS24, which is a year-long effort and a shared commitment to fostering interfaith collaboration and civic engagement in many critical elections taking place around the world in 2024, where the Parliament's grounding document toward a global ethic comprises 5 directives, including a commitment to a culture of nonviolence, to solidarity, to a just economic order, to equal rights, and to sustainability. In this spirit, it's a pleasure to introduce our first panelist, the Reverend Charline Manuel, who is a trustee of the Parliament of the World's Religions and is also the chair of the Parliament's Global Ethic Committee. Reverend Manuel is senior minister for over 30 years and serves as well on the board of directors for Unity World Headquarters. She's also a seminary professor for over 15 years, preparing religious leaders in navigating contemporary life in the United States today. Among her many experiences in leadership, Reverend Manuel brings a record of leading successful efforts, including development of urban affordable housing, which also involved organizational work in Haiti and Costa Rica, to just name 2. This webinar is also part of CEIE's continued collaboration with Temple de Hirsch Sinai, the most comprehensive Reformed Jewish synagogue in the Pacific Northwest, at which Rabbi Daniel Weiner is the senior rabbi, with whom Seattle University shares a dedicated multi-decade tradition of educating clergy each spring at the Clergy Interfaith Institute. Rabbi Weiner has served as the senior rabbi at Temple de Hirsch for over 2 decades, working across religious lines and within civic circles, on regional and national boards, and within university life. In collaboration with Daniel Weiner, this webinar is part of our collective determination to respond to weakening liberal democracies in the world, including, as I mentioned, in the U.S. Next on our panel, the Reverend Terry Kyllo serves as Executive Director of Paths for Understanding. In his work with agencies local to national, including consulting with Shoulder to Shoulder, based in Washington, D.C., Reverend Kyllo is an active voice and a trusted local partner and leader. A pastor working across Lutheran and Episcopal lines throughout the region and in national circles addressing Christian supremacy and countering anti-Muslim bigotry, for which he is well respected. Also on our panel is Mr. Frank So, who serves on the board of 4 nonprofits, including 2 faith-based organizations, and has served at the United Nations and as a U.S. diplomat in several countries over the past 10 years, including a most recent appointment with the Office of the Vice President of the United States before becoming the Executive Director at Ecumenical Ministries of Oregon. And finally, we welcome Mr. Bill de Blasio, highly respected two-term mayor of New York City, with a consistent record of commitment in working with diverse cultural and religious communities amid the realities of being mayor within the largest, most diverse metropolitan region in the United States. So we're in excellent hands, friends, for a conversation on a two-part question below, which is framed around the Parliament's FOCUS24. And here is our question prompt. Given your leadership context, explain what you see as the most substantial challenge facing our country in 2024 as we move toward this election cycle. What is that challenge, given all that you've experienced and seen, drawing on your wisdom and on the work that you've done in the years prior? And given that challenge that you've identified, what are the best options for people of goodwill to respond in their families, in their communities, at work, in civic spaces, and respond directly to the challenge that you identify? We've given each panelist 8 minutes to provide their response to the challenge and to the response to the challenge itself. And then we'll engage in a question and answer starting at around 12:50 or East Coast time 3:50. And we'll close after that. The panelists know at that time, after that half hour, they're free to stay or go. But those who remain, and those of you in the audience, will continue in a breakout session and smaller group activity where we also will address this question. What do we see as the challenge? And how do we respond today? And we'll continue then until the top of the hour at 2 p.m. Pacific, that's 5 p.m. Eastern. We begin then with our first, and I'll actually identify these in order. We begin first with Mr. Bill de Blasio, Reverend Charline Manuel, Rabbi Weiner, Mr. Frank So, and then Reverend Terry Kyllo. I want to make sure that there we are, Mr. de Blasio, you're with us. Thank you so much, sir. It's a pleasure to begin with you. It's nice to see you. Thank you for joining. Let's go ahead and begin with our first with you.
Thank you very, very much, Michael. I'm really appreciative to be a part of this gathering. It's talking about what we all need to talk about, and with folks who I think can have a particularly powerful impact. So I'm really thrilled to be here. And Michael, feel free to interrupt at the 8-minute mark at the New Yorker. I will take no offense at interruption. So, look, I think, as I thought about this challenge and talked to Michael about it yesterday, it really dawned on me that the thing I keep feeling and experiencing all over the country as I talk to people is the desperate need to redefine what democratic participation means. So rather than say, the great challenge before us is the crisis of democracy or other sort of, in effect, negatives, I'm almost presenting a positive. We have a gift. It's an imperfect gift. We've had it for a quarter of a millennium in this country, but it is clearly frayed, in some ways outmoded, desperately needs an update and an overhaul, and that is not going to come from the top down. And that's where I think redefinition is the right way to think about it. And in fact, a benevolent way to think about it, to say that, we may have a history that tells us that our democratic ideals and institutions were created by a certain set of individuals, and we invoke them, even if there's more critical thinking towards them at this point. We invoke them. It was something sort of given to us to then exercise. I think that script needs to be flipped at this point. I think at this point, the best chances for the hope and future of democracy come from the grassroots up. The best chance for healing divide, the partisan divide, the culture of negativity that has certainly grown, particularly because of social media. The best way to address all of that is from the ground up. And that's where I think the gathering of folks here today, it's a perfect gathering, because I have found in my work in New York, but also far beyond that, the voices of faith communities travel farthest and deepest in many ways. And I think a lot of people are listening. My strong view, and I particularly traveled around the country in 2019 and talked to a lot of folks about what they were feeling. My fundamental view is that people don't like this current situation. I'm not saying something novel, but I think it's really important that we acknowledge it very frontally. the atmosphere of division and negativity is not comfortable. It's not natural. It's not what people want. In fact, when you go to the more communal level of life, you usually find the opposite. When you think about everything from houses of worship to workplaces to neighborhoods to little leagues and civic organizations, you name it. There's generally a spirit of cooperation, even where there's differences, a sense of trying to find some common ground, trying to find some common source of pride and connection. I actually think that's more of our essential nature. But the superstructures around us stand in the way of that in many ways. The broader political process, even though I'm deeply engaged in it, I'm the first to say I don't think it's fostering that kind of sense of ownership and community. Certainly, with all due respect to our friends in the media, they could do a lot better. I think the entire corporate sector could do a lot better. So my hope is at the grassroots. And I think we need to recognize that is an empowering concept, whether within a community of worship, whether in any kind of local organic space, gathering, organization, geographical space. There's ample opportunity for people to participate and model good behavior and show that there's a different kind of sort of stakeholder mentality rather than waiting on someone else to make change or waiting for someone else to set a better tone. How do we show people that it's all their responsibility? Look, obviously, I'm someone who believes that voting is a crucial part of that. But I only think, voting by definition, you do, once a year or a few times a year, depending on what's going on. But I'm thinking much more deeply about community participation and the fact that we need to retrain people in almost the traditions of things like the New England town hall meetings and other examples of more grassroots direct democracy. We need to show people that they can have an impact at the most local level. Maybe it is a climate or environmental concern. Maybe it is something about injustice, civil or human rights. Maybe it is something very practical. One of the things, big issue in New York City for many years, how to make our streets safer, how to protect, in particular, children and seniors from dangerous traffic by changing street design, and by having a community process to talk about what would actually calm traffic and make people safer. I think there's so many examples where people being involved locally to solve local problems actually is the antidote to this negative superstructure. So finishing on the concept of action, I think this is happening. Obviously, many of the organizations and the communities of worship and the different affiliations that so many people here have are extremely focused on engagement. But I'd like to just sort of supercharge that a little bit and say, how much? This is my good challenge to you. How much are you consistently asking the folks who you work with, who you influence, to be engaged in their local communities? Whether it is voting, whether it's working on a local issue, whether it's volunteering in a school, are you giving people the maximum incentive and focus to do that? Is that a subject of conversation, that the healing of our nation and the preservation of our democracy runs through each person's individual decision? I'll finish by saying, I truly believe, I have no question in my mind, never have, that if everyone was voting, you'd have a very different country. So I'm just using that as an easy prism. But let's put aside voting. If everyone who could volunteer and engage in civic activity and in the betterment of their communities was engaged, it would change the tonality intensely. The vast majority of people would not want conflict. They would want connection. They would want mutual respect and dialogue and common ground. So I conclude by saying maximizing civic and communal participation is actually the antidote. Fixing the problem from the ground up, inspiring and encouraging people to believe that they can re-own their society and heal the wounds by their own example is where I think everyone gathered today can have a huge impact. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. de Blasio. Stakeholder mentality, how much engagement, and that sense of mutual respect for dialogue, for the healing and preservation of democracy, among other things you've said, ring with us. Very much appreciate your words. Let's move now to Reverend Charline Manuel. Thank you, Reverend Manuel, for your 8 minutes.
Sorry about that. Thank you, Dr. Trice, and certainly it is an honor to be a part of this esteemed panel. It was January 15th of this year when I opened my computer and found two stories, two headlines side by side. Most people might have thought them to have no connection at all, not me. One was for the results of the 2024 election in Taiwan. The headline read, "Taiwan's election was a clear show of defiance in the face of Chinese intimidation and pressure." The other, celebrations around the country for Martin Luther King Jr.'s birthday. Dr. King was outspoken in human rights domestically, but also outspoken in internal affairs, as he talked of our interconnectedness, saying, if we are to survive as a species, we must develop a world perspective. I thought if King were alive that day, he should or would probably have something to say about Taiwan's election victory and China's looming intimidation toward them. He would certainly have much to say, knowing that the democracy in the US is on the ballot as well. I was guided to look through a book of Dr. King's speeches and sermons, and the page fell open to his last sermon that he gave the Sunday before he was assassinated. The message was titled, "Remaining Awake Through a Great Revolution." In his sermon, he opened with the telling of the old story that many of us probably read in our youth, the story of Rip Van Winkle. As Rip went up the mountain where he would eventually fall asleep, he noticed a sign. It was a picture of King George III of England. When Rip came down the mountain 20 years later, the sign had a picture of George Washington, the first president of the United States. Rip, of course, was confused. He didn't know where he was. He had no idea what had happened. King warns us of what it means when we fall asleep during a time of major social change, lest we wake up when it is all done to say, how did this happen and how did we get here? Living amid a period of great social change is easy to be silent. It may seem easier to let someone else worry about the consequences of the change we refuse to explore. It may be easier to stay home than stand in long lines to vote. It may be easier to let leaders off the hook and accept empty promises without question. It may be easier to just wait and see what happens. But King warns us that we should pay attention, participate, get involved. In other words, remain awake during a time like this when our very freedoms are on the line. His words were appropriate for 60 years ago, and yet the same warning applies to us today. The current alarm has been ringing quietly, consistently, and sometimes behind closed doors for just about as long as Rip Van Winkle was asleep. The alarm is now a piercing siren raging toward out of control, allowing the obliteration of freedoms that have been our hope toward someday achieving a fair, just, and peaceful society. I remember being glued to my television set January 6th of 2021, outraged, sad, and a bit frightened at the attack on our Capitol in DC. It was a Rip Van Winkle moment. I clearly remember asking myself, how did we get here? Looking back, all the warnings were there, all the signs were there, and mostly in plain sight. Perhaps too many of us had fallen asleep, missed or dismissed, maybe even completely rejected what was unthinkable, unbelievable. With a period of great uncertainty before us, how do we remain awake through this time when the threat of our democracy is at stake? And I have 6 very basic ideas that I want to share. There are more, but this is 6, and these are very basic. The first one is Take time to become informed and stay informed. Pay attention to what's happening. This is a time to be curious, a time to ask questions. Second, vote. Make sure that we do not only get out and vote, but we encourage others to do the same, even in those states where legislators have worked very diligently to make it difficult to cast a vote in communities they have carefully targeted. 3, do our own due diligence on the candidates and the key leaders, rather than blindly voting for someone. 4, for those who have religious or spiritual communities, remain steadfast in the values that shape how we live, that shape our attitudes, that shape our actions. 5, this one should go without saying, but it's very important to repeat, to say, remember to be kind to ourselves and to others. Anxiety levels are high and rising. Polarization is a real thing, and things will not always go as we want them to go, but it costs us nothing to be kind, even to those who disagree with us. Kindness feels better to the soul than anger and hostility. And 6, however we show up in our lives in leadership roles, remember to walk our talk, act with integrity, honor the power of our words, and live conscious that our actions matter as an example to others. I think it is incumbent on every person to find their point of optimism for our shared future. This is not the time to lose hope. This is the time to believe in the goodness of humanity. There are people who are making a positive difference in our communities and in the world, and we honor those good works if we can join them, or at the very least, not lose heart. As was said when I was introduced, I serve on the board of the Parliament of the World's Religions. The Parliament's signature document, the Global Ethic, is one of my personal points of optimism. In 1993, for the first time in history, representatives of all the world's major religions agreed that there are common ethical commitments foundational to each of their traditions. I am inspired by the level of cooperation, collaboration, and consciousness it took to arrive at a common ground amongst our religious and spiritual teachings, and yet it is a secular document, a document that includes no religious language except for one mention of ultimate reality. The very idea of how this document was drafted, that anyone, religious or not, can abide by values we hold in common without coercion or force, it gives me hope for the future. The global ethic is a tool that can be a catalyst to shape how we feel and how we move forward to participate in the world that we live in, and one that we can be proud of. The document referred to as the Global Ethic, mostly drafted by Professor Hans Kuhn, is in consultation with several hundred leaders and scholars, has been an official document of the Parliament of the World's Religions for 30 years. The Global Ethic describes 5 moral commitments it refers to as directives. Very quickly, a commitment to a culture of nonviolence and respect for life. 2, solidarity and a just economic order. 3, tolerance and a life of truthfulness. 4, equal rights and partnerships between men and women. 5, sustainability and care for the earth. And finally, the global ethic expresses the view that the religions cannot single-handedly solve the environmental, economic, political, and social problems we face. It also states that Earth cannot be changed for the better unless the consciousness of individuals is changed first. And that is where our ethical, spiritual, and religious teachings can move us toward a global ethic and bring into being a world of peace, justice, and sustainability, where every human being is humanely treated.
Thank you, Dr. Reverend Manuel. We really appreciate your comments. Insight from Interconnections, calling us from Dr. King to January 6th, and to pay attention, points of optimism that you identify in those 6 ways as you've named them. We now move to Rabbi Daniel Weiner and your 8 minutes. Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you. I'm truly grateful for the spirit of support, resolve, and visioning toward change reflected in this program and the Parliament more broadly. These efforts would be critical at any time, but particularly in this moment. I'm also very sensitive to what Mr. de Blasio said about focusing on the positive, although I'm influenced by the Jewish ethos, inspired by the biblical prophets to go with doom and gloom first, and then to assess hope and optimism moving forward. So the key challenge I see, shared by so many others in facing the country at this moment, is an amplification and exacerbation of the polarization, demonization, and alienation that grew substantially over the last 8 years, not coincidentally aligned with the rise of Trumpism and MAGA, and has only worsened and is worsening in the run-up to this next election. There's a variation of Newton's law of physics, but as expressed kind of through sociology, that the rise of nativism and populism on the political right, with its attendant intolerance and deepening of misinformation and disinformation through social media and now AI, has elicited an equal and opposite rise of identity-driven illiberalism and reductionism on the left. And both of these have cohered into a pursuit of a kind of autocracy and revanchism that ultimately threatens the liberal democratic order that has been the blessing and the boon of modernity since the Enlightenment. And especially for we people of faith, the rise of white Christian nationalism and other forms of religious extremism in the service of these movements truly threatens to both anchor them as expressions of core identity and further taint and discredit faith as a mere tool of political power and privilege. I believe that the most potent response and remedy lies in the kinds of things we are doing here in Seattle, and particularly at Seattle University and at the Center. As illustrated in the work of David Alcott and others whom we are welcoming for our Clergy Institute of Interfaith studies in about a month, while faith is being exploited as the handmaiden of politics and providing cover for autocratic fever dreams, those of us who value and live out our faith and theology and the good works for society and the world that grow from them must reclaim the mantle of authentic religion from those who use it as cudgel and justification for base motives, by both identifying and critiquing their misuse, and by offering a positive and redemptive vision for how it can both heal current division and provide a pathway to a better future. Toward that goal, it's important for our traditions to see that the universal goals and particular pride of our traditions are not only not mutually exclusive, but they are actually complementary. Certainly the universal values of the sacredness of life, the dignity of the individual, freedom of thought and speech, and compassion for others as a core human quality are the worthy virtues that we all share, and that therefore bind our many traditions in common cause toward the common good. But we must also affirm the holiness of those ideals that render us distinct, and more broadly, the need to defend and protect those distinctions for others as we would hope for ourselves. And yes, these efforts cannot merely languish on the altar of sacred precincts and the ivory towers of seminaries and seminars. They must inform the throne rooms and legislatures of temporal power and be a significant part of the discourse in the public square. And it is possible to do so carefully and judiciously in ways that sustain the important wall between church and state. For example, in the run-up to this election, in a manner that has classically enabled houses of worship to maintain their tax-exempt status, faith communities must be vocal and expansive in 1, identifying the challenges and issues of the day, 2, sharing insights unique to our traditions that speak to these issues, insights not found in secular circles and ideology, Freudian slip, and 3, entering the political process through messaging and organizing, joining coalitions that transcend the divides rather than exacerbating them. And we need to be willing to go well beyond the walls of our sanctuaries, virtually and incarnated, so to speak, using the best minds of marketing and branding in our communities, particularly amongst young adults, to get our message out in ways that break through the cacophony of distractions that render all but the most viral messages mute. And by viral, that often means the ones that make the body politic ill. And to torture that metaphor just a bit further, we must bring the permeating vaccine of the best of the good news of faith into people's lives and consciences. And we have a successful track record of faith speaking to concerns for abolitionism, labor unions, civil rights, peace movements, and LGBTQIA+ rights. Here in Washington State, faith communities were instrumental in passing key legislation for gun responsibility, same-sex unions, and women's reproductive health. We've done this before, and we must do so now. Because whereas in the past most elections were about differences in policy and program, and thus our involvement was helpful but incidental, the gravity and stakes now are urgent and Manichaean, truly a life or death determination as to whether our current system of government and civilizational basis, with all of its faults and needs for improvement, and still the Churchillian worst form of human organization, save for all others, whether it will survive and thrive, or will it be relegated to the cyclical history of toggling between flourishing and suffering? In our tradition, the Jewish tradition and Christian tradition, the prophet is often reticent to take the reins of power and enter the fray of worldliness, for it is precisely the kind of person needed for prophecy who spurns such base pursuits. But God, or at least the progenitors of our tradition, prevailed in convincing them to stand up and to lean in it. For despite such aversions, when the times require the voice of heaven and the call of conscience, it would be spiritual and moral malpractice not to share the timeless wisdom of faith, to speak to the hopes of a new dawn and a new day. I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi Weiner, from your discussion beginning with polarization, but also the encouragement to join coalitions and transcend divides that are exacerbated, the sense of transcendence and what happens when our call of conscience is given over to moral malpractice. There's something that religions must hold the line against that. Thank you for that reminder. We will return to these themes later. And now we move to Mr. Frank So. Mr. So, to you.
Thank you, Michael. I think what I'd like to do is first start with, Rabbi Weiner's comment about doom and gloom. As a Catholic, I eat guilt for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. So I definitely understand how you feel. To a lot of the points that have been said by the previous speakers, it's a wonderful thing to be able to discuss this in a somewhat progressive bubble. And I also understand that there are those who do not think like us. And that's why I think some of the words that have been said by the previous speakers about being kind, about acknowledging that there has to be a voice from the other that has to be also respected is important. When asked about this question about our greatest challenge, the first thing that came to mind is the importance of thinking critically. And in a world in which we're living in that is 140 characters or based on quick rhetoric, we quickly go to these things based out of fear. Rather, I often ask colleagues and at different forums not to think of immediate answers, but to rather think that we may not have the answer, but what we may need to do is ask the right questions. And I think that is an important thing that we need to do in our lunch meetings, in our dinner meetings, in our happy hours, in churches and synagogues and mosques. We need to start asking the right questions. The idea of cognitive dissonance is that uncomfortability between what we feel and what we believe. And I truly believe, especially with a lot of young people that we work with different communities of color on the grassroots level, that there are some communities, you could say, that are more conservative, more in the red, that deep inside feel like, I'm not against certain people, but I believe in this quick answer of building a wall or stopping immigration. But when we get to being thoughtful instead and introspective, and instead of siding with fear, we get to a better discussion. When we discuss what our greatest challenge is, I really do believe that our greatest challenge in this, and this puts it in context of an on-the-ground, workable, everyday approach, is to really push critical thinking. It's not thinking what, which is given to us by so many people, especially as we're talking about AI now. This is what you should think. but really how to think and why to think. And this is a discussion that we need to have. When we ask for any organization, whether it's police to have reforms, any institution at all, we're asking, can the institution be better without hating the people in the institution? We have seen here in the Portland area swastikas. We've seen anti-Semitic statements being made. We have seen Islamophobia as well towards members of our Arab community. We need to be able to ask questions such as, can you agree with the state of Israel and yet disagree in the state of war that we're in? And right now there's a conflict where if I go to a pro-Palestinian rally, am I an anti-Semitic person? This is creating divisions in the Portland community and in Oregon as a whole. And instead of having this pegged as a war between religions, it should be, as Rabbi Weiner said and Reverend Manuel, we should have religion be the source of what grounds us, the truth. And so we as a faith community need to use our abilities, our forums to bring people together. My challenge to all of you listening and all of you who listen afterwards is, how can we discuss the issues that are coming up in an honest, truthful, and respectful fashion towards empathy? It's not because it's something nice to do, but in this election year, something that we must do. And I'll stop there. Thank you, Michael.
Thank you very much, Mr. So. And this question of kindness and importance and critical thinking, not so much in terms of the what, but the how, and empathy IQ, as you've identified as a unique contribution to the conversation, among other things you've said. Thank you so very much for your words. Now moving to Reverend Terry Kyllo. Reverend Kyllo.
Well, I'm just so honored to be on the panel, and I'm just soaking in all the beautiful thoughts and wisdom that just came across the screen here to me, and kind of overwhelmed by it, honestly. So 50% of Americans are lonely. And as I have gone out and talked to people in different communities, what I am seeing is that we're not only lonely individually, we are nearly segregated and separated as communities. While there may be areas of the nation where people of diverse traditions and cultures get together regularly to respect each other, that's not the case for most people. So I began to work to counter anti-Muslim bigotry in 2015 because I became really concerned about the state of our democracy, the fact that human beings can often be tempted by exclusive in-grouping, the idea that our group's not only best for us or not only good, but is better than others, that we can then begin to dehumanize others, and how that dehumanization leads to violence against real human beings, against our neighbors. It turns us against each other. And so I began to have conversation with people of many different traditions, literally atheist to Zoroastrian, Buddhist, Christians, Jewish folks, Muslims, Sikhs, Hindus, and so many more. And I began to ask, what can we do about this moment of deep divisiveness, this deep polarization, this deep separation that we're in? And as I began to listen, and I want to be clear why I asked the question of so many different people, I asked the question because I'm a Christian. I was raised in white Christian supremacy, to believe that Christianity is the only way to God and God's only way to us. But I've grown to understand that that was not Jesus' vision at all. And so I began to listen out of my commitment to Jesus, to hear what other people would say about what we can do in this moment of great divisiveness. And so what I began to hear was three things: that community to community, we need to eat together and share stories, to look into each other's eyes and see each other as human beings. And that's not simply happening across many parts of our community here in the United States. Number two, we need to do some kind of action to benefit the larger community together. That when people see folk of different tradition and strongly held beliefs working together across lines of difference, well, they begin to say, oh, wow, maybe we're not as divided hopelessly as we think. Maybe there's some hope for us yet. And then the third strategy that emerged from almost all the traditions was to find ways to honor one another in public. And so our organization put together, after years of thought, a process called Let's Go Together to create 3 events to eat and share stories, no politics, no policy, no debating, just have people see each other as people. To do a service project day, and then to have leaders of those traditions on a 3rd event to gather together and share how, from their tradition, it's important to see everyone as human. But then as I began to think about this, this year that we're in, and how threatened our democracy is with all the polarization and division, as I began to think more about how many people are buying into a lie that our identity as human beings can be reduced to that of our political party or the president we support. And a second lie by about 30 to 40% of Americans, that when people of diverse traditions and cultures are together, we can't get along. And so therefore we have to maintain or create a caste system, where many of my white Christian supremacist brothers and sisters are hoping to throw aside our democracy in order to maintain that caste system and to make sure that they're the first ones in line. I began to think with my staff about what we could do this year. And so we came up with a toolkit called a potluck for democracy. And in that toolkit is a way for people to build relationship from one group to another across lines of culture and tradition, a lot across lines of life experience or life circumstance, and across other forms of identity. And in doing so, I think what happens, as we saw with a recent event, is that people come in despairing that we can't live together, despairing that we can't get along together, that we can't build a brighter future together. And they begin to realize that they came in as strangers, but they left as family, because we are one human family. And so what I want to propose is not just a nationwide strategy, but a neighbor-to-neighbor strategy and a neighborhood-to-neighborhood strategy. And so our potluck toolkit is intended to help people to get folk together across these lines of difference. Because if we can do that, what happens is that the entire community begins to say, hey, wait a minute. You know, maybe we are different, and maybe we have some serious differences about the direction the country should go in, and that's fine. But maybe we're also better together. Maybe we also can see each other as human beings. And so I believe that we can't solve Facebook with Facebook or politics with politics, even though both are important. I think we have to solve these with face-to-face interactions and experiences. And that in doing so, we can help to build out some of what we've talked about today from the other panelists in terms of finding our power. Communities of wisdom have power right now. It's not just the power to preach or pray. It is the power to partner with people in local communities. And when folks see that, what they do is they take a deep breath and they go, I'm so relieved that we don't have to live like this. Because friends, we don't have to live like this.
Reverend Kyllo, thank you very much. And thank all of you for your time. We have one question. Let me just pause for a moment. I want to encourage all of you who are listening. This is an opportunity now to send your questions forward. The panel would like to entertain your questions, respond to them. There are also questions that panelists may have for one another. I'd like those panelists to think about that, the questions you'd have for one another. I will also read these questions as they come. We already have one, but as we're preparing for that and others are writing questions, I'd like to begin our time together in the next 25 to 28 minutes by simply beginning with one question and cycling back to a theme I heard common amongst all of you. Going back to Mr. de Blasio first and asking you all to perhaps join in conversation around this theme, beginning with you, Mr. de Blasio. You mentioned the topic of what it means to be a shareholder in community. I think many of you resonated with this. Kind of mentality of a shareholder, different, let's say, from someone who would be a stakeholder in a community, different from a shareholder. Stakeholder is someone who is rooted in their local context, someone who understands that the preservation of one's community is simultaneously an act of preservation for democracy. Healing of democracy means that I am also maximizing my sense of civic participation, that I am engaged in that work. And many of you spoke to different themes about that as critical to next steps. Wherever one is on the band of religious, philosophical, or spiritual identity, that is a shared kind of civic responsibility. I wonder first, Mr. de Blasio, if you could say a little more about what you mean by this sense of a stakeholder identity. And then perhaps I'd like to ask a couple of you if you would respond to this idea a little more in terms of how you're thinking about, in your communitarian context, where that makes most sense in terms of rootedness in community, this sense of not just participating in community, but belonging fully. Could you say a little more first, Mr. de Blasio, about this concept?
Sure. Thank you, Michael. I will start with the sort of the opposites of what I'm hoping for, because I think it paints the picture. It's just wonderfully coincidental today. I was like getting some music videos on YouTube, and up popped an ad. I have the cheap version of YouTube where there's ads, and up popped an ad, and the ad started with a disgruntled individual saying, "The government is lying to you and stealing from you." And the next line is, "The last stimulus check you received was not supposed to be the last one. There's supposed to be another one you received." And I cut it off there. But what I loved about it, and I thought spoke volumes to this very topic, is the idea of outrage and disassociation from our nation, our government, the notion of being cheated, and then how ironic what the individual was speaking to being cheated of was something that actually could be considered a positive, an act of goodwill, an act of charity, an act of inclusion, that in our greatest crisis ever, arguably the pandemic, the government actually came forward and provided checks directly to people. So what we could say is, what a wonderful communal moment as a nation, that there was actually a common effort to save us all. Here was this very cynical interpretation that somehow we were being deprived. And what I took from that is that the constant barrage of disassociation, disconnection, the fact that the opening up of our dialogue, the impact of the internet and social media, the doubt that's been created about so many organizations, institutions, parts of our society, many doubts well placed, have had the bad effect of giving people very little to believe in. And that's why we've seen so many problems in terms of voting, so many problems in terms of people being able to trust the things that were honest and real in government or law enforcement or different institutions. I think, again, the antidote to this is sort of say, okay, something's happened here that is painful, that is, although rooted in some very valid questions about what was not filled with integrity in these organizations, in our government, in our institutions. And it's great that some of that was questioned. But what's ultimately happened is a degradation of the ability to believe, to participate, to be part of something. And I dare say, I think a lot of our corporate structures have deepened that by continually pushing materialism, individualism, convenience, disconnect from anything communal. So I'll finish by saying, I think the idea here is regenerating community, regenerating a sense of ownership, almost thinking back to our roots in a good, healthy way. We started out with all our imperfections as a nation and all our contradictions, particularly on issues like slavery. Still was the concept of, here was a collection of people oppressed by a foreign power, deciding to take matters in their own hand, create a nation, and surprisingly create a set of very, very progressive visionary concepts like freedom of expression or not having a state religion, and freedom of religion. And those ideas sprung from people in communities, and it was based on their communal experience, and they lived it. I think we need to almost reimagine, what if we had that stakeholder mentality again? What if we were creating a nation anew? What if we said, okay, the model we've worked with, the experience we've had has served us in some ways, but at this point has ceased to function in the sense of people having enough commonality, enough sense that they're all part of something. We need to regenerate that from the ground up. And so my conclusion is to say, every time people experience that notion of ownership, they want a pothole filled, they want a road fixed, or they want to make sure a child gets into a school that is best for them, or there's a park that needs to be cleaned up, or a beach that needs to be cleaned up, or an interfaith gathering. I loved what Reverend Kyllo said. I think even the very act of saying we're going to heal by our very presence, all of these things regenerate sort of that concept of we're actually a community of people that get to make decisions for ourselves, not being dictated to by something far away and untouchable. And that, I think, is our mission.
I wonder if we could stay with this just a little further. This is something that Dr. Manuel, you mentioned in your items. How do we remain awake in 6 ways? Staying with a stakeholder mentality, due diligence on our research on candidates and leaders, remaining steadfast with our values are 2 that you mentioned as well. Rabbi Weiner, you, along with that same kind of line of thought, noted yes to our values, but also we need to defend the distinctions of others. And as was mentioned, Reverend Kyllo, we need to heal by presence, as Mr. de Blasio had mentioned. I wonder if the 3 of you, and also with you, Mr. So, could say a little more about how is it what are the various elements in which we do the heavy lifting, the difficult work of maintaining in community like this? Reverend Manuel, you're on mute. No, you're trying to speak there.
Sorry about that. Yeah, first, I believe that people actually crave connection. We have fallen into a place where we, we're on our cell phones. I mean, we've all heard this story. When you go to a restaurant and you see a whole family of people sitting in the restaurant and they're all on their phones. They're all sitting together, but they're not together because they're on their phones. Mm-hmm. But the truth is, I think people truly crave connection, and we have been sort of conditioned out of or away from connection, which, as Reverend Kyllo mentioned earlier, the large number of people who actually experience loneliness. But we've fallen into this place where we have allowed that to be okay. And I think at some point, if it's one by one potluck for democracy or whatever at a time, one by one, we are going to have to change that way that we've fallen into and actually pull people out of that separation, out of that segregation, and say, hey, come have coffee with me. Or listen, I'm going to go for a walk. You feel like going for a walk tonight? I'll tell a quick story. I live with my daughter, and we just moved into a new house, and it's a very different kind of a neighborhood. I live in Florida, and I think probably half of my neighbors, if not more, are probably of a different political persuasion than the 2 of us. And our first few days here, we had some tension with some neighbors who were kind of more curious about us than anything else. And my daughter had a great idea. She said, let's have a book club for all the ladies who had kind of come and said some not so nice things and all that kind of stuff. And I'm thinking, do I want to sit in a book club with these people? And they're already in. This is me. I'm the minister and she's not, right? So we started this. It's very interesting. Started this book club. And we decided no politics, because we realized we were different in that regard. But we have a book. We study the book. And it is amazing. It is amazing. It's like your potlucks, Kyllo. It's that our hearts have turned, and now there is a connection. One of the ladies who lives across the street, her son has her husband has Parkinson's, and she is of a different political persuasion than us. And she admitted that she was afraid of my 2 grandsons. They're very tall, they're very strong. And now she will come over occasionally and say to them, can you help me? I can't get him out of bed. Would you be willing? And that turned everything for all of us. She was vulnerable enough to admit that she needed help. And she had opened her mind. So now she's not afraid of my grandsons. And this great relationship has evolved. But had we left it where it was when we first moved to this neighborhood, it was tension waiting to happen, to be quite frankly. It was tension waiting to happen. So we crave connection. I think we've kind of lost, how do we do that? How do we connect with each other and be bold enough, be willing enough to just, make that step forward and say, hey, I'm a friend. We don't have to believe everything that we believe with each other, but I'm not here to hurt you. I really want the best for you. Let's live together in harmony. And it actually works. And that sounds so simple. It really sounds so simple. You would think, duh, but it is the thing that we must do and that we can do, because we really all do want to be connected to others. We're social beings. We really want to be connected. So we just have to try harder and keep at it. If it's one cup of coffee or one book club or one serving in the community opportunity or whatever it is. But I love the potlucks for democracy. Yeah. I love that. Yeah. I'm going to start that. I'm going to start doing that.
We're going to share that. We're going to share that for all you watching as well. Reverend Kyllo is going to share. Thank you so much, Reverend Manuel. Rabbi Weiner, what are your thoughts on this in terms of this defending the distinctions of others, or other thoughts that align to this sense of the stakeholder mentality?
Yeah, listen, I think you don't have to be you don't have a PhD in the development of religion to understand that community was probably one of the most compelling elements that is the basis of all of our religions and the development of religion more generally. And it just so happens that the dissolution of community, the feeling of loneliness and alienation, is what so many people are feeling today, and is the source, I think, of so much of our societal maladies and individual mental health challenges. And so I think perhaps the idea of reaffirming community is something that we can, as faith people, of leaders in faith traditions, can kind of double down on and say, look, perhaps this is one of the great bits of wisdom that we can both reclaim and kind of reassert at this moment, and say, particularly people who are moved by religious traditions, to say, look, this is foundational, and it's not just religious traditions tribally within your own group. It's really going beyond and understanding that breaking bread together, forging community together, is not just one of the greatest insights of faith communities, but really is a human need for which we are hardwired and for which we were created, if you go with that kind of mindset. And so I think that is perhaps one of the key elements and insights that we as as leaders of faith traditions can offer to a moment in which that sense of disconnect is so profoundly felt. And again, so often in a world in which there's so many that there's a tendency to oversimplify and flatten things into binaries. It's not either or. Our religious traditions are about embracing a universalistic sense of compassion and connection to all people, but also a sense of particular pride in what our distinct communities have to offer. And those are not mutually exclusive. Those are actually complementary. We can embrace kind of the values of universalism, but at the same time respect other people's particular pride and the distinctions that they have in their religious faith, in the way that we hope others will respect our unique particular pride.
Let me move then to you, Mr. So, because you said something very important that I think we also need to account for. I mean, you identified some of the kind of dissonance, the cognitive dissonance, the kinds of, we have to start asking the right kinds of questions of what's happening in the country. Kindness, yes, that's important. Critical thinking, not the what, but the how of what's happening in our country. And there is a very strong contingent in the country who we might suggest would push the U.S. Constitution aside and would be very comfortable with the creation of a kind of theocratic state, be very comfortable with a kind of fusion in which the state, the country itself, would be guided by a sense of governance that would see the conditions of our historical documents kind of re-scripted, and where our understanding historically of a liberal democracy and even the values that shape that would be compromised. That's a part of the conditions of the kind of existential threat that we would say we're in right now, the crisis of our moment. So yes, religion has a role in terms of being kind toward others and staking its claim on shared values. But there's also a crisis at the moment in terms of the cognitive distance that you're identifying. Mr. So, could you say a little more about what you intend with that, what you see there as that challenge, and yes to empathy, but what does that require of us in the face of that kind of crisis today?
Yeah, thank you, Michael. You know, there's a great quote by a philosopher named Thucydides, and he says, "The secret to happiness is freedom. The secret to freedom is courage." I think, you know, as Reverend Manuel was talking about that craving, people crave. Humans are not robots. We're not AI. Perhaps one day AI will crave other AI. I don't know, but what I do know is what we see here at a very grassroots level, and taking that bold step to be brave. I think I might have mentioned before that we at Ecumenical Ministries of Oregon will, for the first time, have a rabbi and an imam on our board. We need to set the stage both as organizations, but also as, back to what Mayor de Blasio was saying, back to the community. How do we create a sense of belonging? We have to be courageous to create that environment. Reverend Manuel, it's brave. It's brave. You're Black. You stick out in a community of ultra whites. You are brave. Your daughter, very brave. You know, there's communities who don't even know. Do I call someone who is Black? Do I call them African American? Am I going to offend them? So I might as well just not talk to them. Let's just be honest. There's things we don't know. And so I think, you know, when we talk about empathy, we have to create the conditions for empathy. When Mayor de Blasio is talking about creating a sense of belonging, community, we have to create the environment. And it takes time. And we're in an election year where we feel like we're out of time. And I think that's where we need to go back to what can we do in micro levels. We at Ecumenical Ministries of Oregon have a legislative forum. And we invite candidates from both sides that are running. We invite politicians from both sides to come together, and we start with what is common. We set a stage, a ground stage for people to come in who are on different sides, and some of them on pretty extreme sides. But we bring them together not to argue, but to first work on what's common. And I think we need to take those micro steps. I think that's how we get to stage stronger discussions. I'd also like to just focus on one other comment that was made, and that's the term not mutually exclusive. For some reason, Black Lives Matter means no lives matter. That's incorrect. And sometimes we have to get down to a very basic level of saying the polar bear matters. It's not that we don't care about your dog. It's just that right now, the environment is threatening the existence of the polar bear. Right now, the existence of our African American brothers and sisters is at risk, not mutually exclusive. We need to, I don't know, we need to somehow expand that so that is part of our vocabulary, so that we are not excluding others. We're saying and, not but. And so we need to create those environments, Michael. I think that's very important to creating these micro stakeholder belonging communities that we need. And it's having those awkward conversations, especially with youth. You're like, oh, I don't care. And you're noticing that with a lot of youth. We need to engage them. And so that's my perspective. It's something that we're working clearly on as an organization and in the forums, whether they're online or in presence. We've got to be brave to do this.
I wonder if we could also just have a moment of recognition that in the last few years, given the global health emergency and through the pandemic, over 1 million of those living in the United States lost their lives. The sense of the unevenness by which this pandemic was experienced by those from marginalized and non-majoritarian communities also left its imprint on the American psyche. And we know as well that youth and young adults have gone through what is occurring continuously as an endemic of mental health related crisis. That has also had major implications for this conversation, I would say, and it moves us, I think, to this first question too, which is, how are these stressors also impacting the sense of fear and safety that's in society today? How are people, in ways that are not entirely evident to them, cloistering or moving toward communitarian spaces out of a deep sense of maybe safety that may be unprescribed in terms of why they're moving in particular ways that are really contrarian or toward or against others that they normally may not have been had that global health emergency not taken, or at least not at that particular extreme. I'd like you to join me looking at that first question then, the anonymous attendee identified here, at least in the Q&A that I'm looking at. It's an interesting question for religion and for religious communities. What can a religious community and those leaders do to tamp down religious claims to specialness that sound especially exclusive? In other words, how can you be special and also be inclusive? Is there something about some religions that drives a sense of superiority that becomes then exclusive to such a degree that it becomes debilitating to the national context? It's another way of framing it. How would you like to respond to that, Mr. Blasio?
Yeah, Michael, I'd love to. Even though I'm less expert and less deeply connected to faith communities than folks here, I want to just be a congenital optimist on this point.
Please, yeah.
We're very caught up, understandably, in some of the negativity, the exclusivity that we're seeing in certain religious communities in our country. But I think we have to look at the counter tendency as well and sort of give it its own respect and space. Not so long ago, my family comes out of originally a Catholic tradition, and not so long ago, in many of our lifetimes, Catholic Church was still pretty openly blaming the Jewish community for the death of Jesus, and presenting all sorts of senses of superiority, even in comparison to other Christian communities, let alone non-Christian communities. It's fascinating and powerful development since the Vatican II conclave in the 60s has been this growing sense, epitomized by Pope Francis, of constantly meeting Catholic leaders, meeting with leaders of other faiths, showing common ground, apologizing for past exclusivity and negativity. That's only one current among many. But I think we should remember that just as we are fighting a sort of, I would argue, others have referred to negative, narrow, exclusive, nationalistic, superiorist tendencies, there's a lot of not only ecumenical work being done, but there's a much more ecumenical worldview in the generations coming up. A greater respect and tolerance for people of all backgrounds and belief systems, and a desire to have a society that reflects that. So I think in the end, I'll finish with this. I think the one thing is to give great respect to all of you, and I want to shout out my brother Steve Wilhelm. We've had endless conversations about this, including the center that was created at the airport to give all people of faith a place that was positive and embracing for them. And that kind of thing is happening more and more spaces around the country. That's really positive. That's the sort of culmination of decades and decades of work that's really flowering more and more. I want us to recognize that, but I also want us to recognize that in the end, our circumstance is generational. And I often say to people, not to be political, but just a sort of analytical point, the biggest fault line is not Democrat versus Republican. It is the newer generations and their entirely different worldview that is in the process of replacing, in many ways, a much more exclusionary worldview. It hasn't fully flowered yet. But that's actually what's going to change the country, its politics, and its culture. And I think that's something we can do. Embracing that tendency of younger generations to think more inclusively is a tangible thing we can all do.
Thank you very much, Mr. Blasio. Others to this, the points made to this question it has been asked of us. I'd like to respond to this, or some aspect of the question around exclusivity in particular. Reverend Kyllo.
Yeah, so I grew up, as I said, in Christian white supremacy, and it came up in many ways. And it's taken me a long time of engagement with people of diverse traditions and cultures to even recognize it as the case. And it's been a long journey, and I have more distance to go on that. But I recognize that human beings, as Rabbi Weiner said, need an in-group, and we need a tradition to help us understand how to live out, human life in the real world and in real time. And I think that there's a lot of history, of course, behind this, with the doctrines of discovery among the most powerful, the colonization of this continent, with people who believe they had divine affirmation to invade, search out, destroy, capture, and enslave people of other traditions, based on centuries and centuries of anti-Semitism that grew into anti-Muslim bigotry and on and on. And so I think, part of the challenge here is to let people know that we are committed to our tradition. Like, I'm a committed Christian, but I'm also committed to understanding Jesus in a way that is not exclusive, because I believe that's what Jesus taught. So when people come to me and say, well, why are you standing up for Jewish people? Why are you standing up for indigenous people? Why are you standing up for Muslims? My answer is always very simple: because of Jesus, is what I say. But there is an immense amount of work that I think Christians must do to help people understand that Jesus was not teaching an exclusive kind of religion that said that we're the only ones that have access to God. Then we have to get better at saying it. We have to continue to interrogate our own tradition, and we have to be willing to stand up and be in public with people of diverse traditions, and not only be together, but learn together, learn from each other, and build a better world together. And I just want to say finally, the potluck for democracy, that emerged out of relationship too. I called my indigenous friend Kay. She's an elder in the Upper Skagit tribe, and she's now my sister. And she thought it was a good idea. And then I called up Michael Trice, and I said, Michael, what do you think about this? And so we need each other at every level of this work, because none of us have all the answers, and we can only come at a better future together.
It's hard for me to believe that we're already actually at the half-hour mark of our time together, as I see it. Emma, is that your read as well? I am so incredibly grateful for the time that we've had in conversation. I know there are a number of questions. I'll be responding to all of those as we have a time to move through. I can't see all of them, actually, so I'm just kind of looking at the ones that I have right in front of me. But I do want to say just a few closing comments that I heard all of you speaking to, having had a conversation with each of you and knowing your level of dedication and commitment and the hard work that you are engaged in each and every day. I'm especially grateful for your time today and for the seasoned way in which you speak about the virtues and values that guide and that you're also recommending in your response, from the tactile nature of hope, Reverend Kyllo, to Mr. So, the emphasis on empathy, rooted empathy, empathy that's also self-critical of our own assumptions and suppositions that guide the decisions that we make, and doing that in a transparent way, as you've demonstrated and asked the rest of the panel to do as well. I just so much appreciate that. Rabbi Weiner, the sense of, yes, being positive in faith communities offer responses and must, even as we defend the distinctions of others. And Reverend Manuel, the sense of kindness, but also walking our talk of internal and transparent accountability through all things. And then, I have to say, Mr. de Blasio, this sense of emphasis and trust that I hear in all of you, really, of the grassroots as an empowering concept, not as an empty, abstract idea, but as an organic space where the fruition of our democracy and of the values that we hold actually take root and flourish in the world. I'm very grateful for all of you. Thank you very much for your time. For those who can remain, we will now pivot into a small group activity with those who are with us in the conversation for the next until the top of the hour. So we have another 43 minutes. That's a lot of time. And Emma is going to move us into smaller groups. Is that right, Emma?
Yes.
into our smaller groups. So what we'll be doing, terrific. There's our questions right there, our discussion questions will move us into groups of 3 or 4. And this is exactly as we asked our panelists. So now all of you are panelists in your own right. Isn't this terrific? And we just have a smaller grouping. And I think what we should do, if we can, is actually ask all of us who've been on the panels to move in, if you're here, to move into those smaller group conversation as well. So we join you. And what do we see? Here are the questions as the most substantial challenge facing the country in 2024. And what do you see as the options for people of goodwill in responding? We're going to do this for 15 minutes, and then we're going to come back and share our responses and our conversation together. And let's go ahead and move into that space now. Does that sound right, Emma, to you?
Yes.
So
you're gonna get a notification to move you into these breakout rooms.
You'll receive that and just choose to go there. And we'll reconvene 15 minutes after you enter the room.
All but 2 folks have gone into their rooms.
Great. And I'm not in a room, right?
No, yeah. So the panel, okay, everyone is in their rooms now. So then panelists, I've not assigned you to rooms yet. Let me know who would like to and who would not. Welcome back, everyone. Would love to hear from some of the folks from your breakout discussions on some of the highlights that were talked about, maybe some of the common challenges or some of the common solutions or common opportunities. If anyone would like to share out loud, you can raise your hand and I can allow for you to turn on your microphone. You can also put some comments in the chat. I'll give a moment for people to raise their hands.
And then Emma, can we see this as a co-moderated space so that if the 4 of us would like to comment on, just ask questions of what we're hearing,
Absolutely.
We can do that. Okay, great. We had a good small group just now, very thoughtful.
Yeah, we did. I don't know if any.
Let's start with the folks here among the panelists. Does someone have their hand up? No one has their hand up yet. So let's start with the folks here. Yeah, Charline, would you like to share some highlights from your group discussion?
Yeah, because one of the people in our group is calling from South Africa, and she did say that our discussion was very U.S. centric, which she is correct in that. But what she also said is that many of the same challenges as we talked about them and raised them on the panel certainly apply to politics, if you will, in South Africa. And the big challenge that she identified was that of growing polarization, which is, of course, something that we all talked about. But she did paint this wonderful picture, remind me, in fact, of saying how powerful it is when diverse leaders stand together, from many different religions and backgrounds, come together and stand together to pray together, to move together, to serve together, do things together, how powerful that is, and what a great example that is of what we want to move to and move toward, is that kind of working together, we're, being together, we're better together. And so that was a wonderful reminder, but I could just see that visual of leaders standing together from different traditions and how powerful that is and what a great message it sends.
We were in the same group, so that was a pleasure to be able to hear that those particular points made. There was also an interest expressed, as I recall, in Potluck for Democracy as not just a resource that would be available in the United States, but internationally. The image of faith leaders standing together in a time that has a transnational existential challenge, and the importance of recognizing the value of that in a organization like this just seemed critical. We know that FOCUS24 has numerous themes it's considering. Of course, this one was focused intentionally on the U.S. context, but I know that we know that these are overlapping contexts and need. Why this is a global concern now, why we're seeing these kind of overlapping areas of weakening liberal democracies, for instance, as a pattern in the world, and why we're seeing those challenge points that look remarkably similar, and why we see authoritarian figures rising up that seem like they're playing from the same playbook all at the same time, is a larger question. But I think of our panelists today and how they responded by drawing from the same kind of root resources that they always have, but I think in new and concise ways, given that these challenges are ones that we're facing in the world and require a certain level of diligence that we may not have all collectively seen together in quite some time. That just showed up a bit. Yeah.
And Terry, were you also in the same group, or were you in a different group?
No, our group got to introduce ourselves to each other, and there were a couple of questions that went on, and one of them was, very specific to the United States, which was kind of the structural challenge of the way presidential elections are run here. And how very few states and really very few people will probably determine the next person. And then how do we both overcome that in a way, but what do we say to folk who say, well, there's no reason to vote, there's no reason to participate, there's no reason to reach out. And I think we all kind of came to a sense that we all have to kind of decide who we want to be and what we want to stand for. And that's kind of a lonely leap there, but I think that when we leap into that space of trust and commitment to something greater than ourselves, however we may define that, all of a sudden we find that other people have made that leap with us, and we find a new community, there. And I experienced that with our group today.
And we have a hand up from the audience. David, you should be able to unmute yourself now.
Thank you, Emma. I just wanted to pay tribute to Terry's answer to the discussion that we were having, because he really pointed out that when you vote, you're doing two things. You're contributing to an outcome of an election, but you're also making a personal statement. Your own personal statement about what you believe and what's right and what's wrong. And that is a dual responsibility. So when you look at why do we vote, it's one thing to say because we want to win or our candidate wants to win. Those are certainly materially important, but it is more than that. It is that personal expression. I thought that was very wise, Terry, and I appreciated your point.
Thank you for sharing. Any other responses or any other sharing that anyone would like to make before we go to our closing announcements? All right, well, thank you to everyone for joining our third event of the FOCUS24 series. We just have some closing announcements. Let me share my screen.
Well, while you're doing that, I just want to say thank you. I think this was a great event, and I'm just so honored to have been a part of it. So,
and thank you, sister.
Throughout today's event and throughout the FOCUS24 series, we've highlighted the global ethic document And you can sign that document by going to parliamentofreligions.org/global ethic. Looking forward to the next events of the FOCUS24 series. Mark your calendars for the next events. You can see all events as part of the FOCUS24 series in the FOCUS24 section of the Parliament's website. The next two events are April 18th, Strategies for Community Organizing and Civic Mobilization, and on May 23rd, State of Democracy in Dialogue with the World's Oldest Indigenous Democracy. We'd like to encourage all FOCUS24 participants to engage in the FOCUS24 community space in Zoom throughout the year in between events. After this meeting ends, you can find this community space in your Zoom by going to Team Chat along the top of the Zoom app window and then Channels along the side menu. This is a space for open forum, responding to conversation prompts, sharing resources, and networking. You can head there right after this event to introduce yourself. All FOCUS24 events are recorded and will be accessible to FOCUS24 registrants throughout the year. You can find recordings of past events in the FOCUS24 section of the Parliament's website and clicking on All Access Hub. After the end of the year, these recordings will be archived into the Parliament's digital archives, which Parliament members will continue to have access to. If you are not already a Parliament member, you can become a member today to support the Parliament's work and enjoy access to digital archives, a global network, exclusive events, and Parliament event discounts. Visit parliamentofreligions.org/membership. That's all for our event today. Again, thank you to everyone for joining, and we'll see you at the next event.